So what was I saying? Okay, so this week I'm going to talk about the Torah portion for this week. And I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this right, but it should be Lech Lecha. And I'm wasn't quite prepared, so now I'm trying to look up what it was last week, or what it was is.
It was Noah last week.
Yeah, I realized that since today is Sunday, everywhere you look will now be on next week's. Okay, Lech Lecha, Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 17:27. So it starts with Noah, goes through Abraham, going to Egypt, Hagar, and then some other stuff. So does that sound familiar to anyone? I mean, I'm sure it sounds familiar to Mitch.
The other stuff sounds familiar.
Okay. So just curious, like, with that vague overview and what we already, like, what are things you already can think of that are in this portion, things that stand out to you or you find significant or meaningful?
For me, it's chapter 15 in particular. It's the covenant of walking between the parts. That to me, the significance in that is that, that was a common method of sealing a covenant between two parties at the time. Basically saying, if I don't fulfill my part of this covenant, let me be like these dead animals here. And the fact that God did not subject Abraham to walking that path. He basically walked it and put the entire onus on himself in fulfilling the covenant. That has a lot of significance, at least to me.
Yeah, I mean, with Don's teaching, that completely has reshaped my thought process regarding what Jesus did on the cross and everything like that. That was not about necessarily Jesus as my personal savior kind of a thing. It was, that typical evangelical understanding and changing it to be, this is a fulfilling of an actual contract that was literally sort of signed in blood. So yeah, I would say that's probably a significant portion for me too, Mitch.
Another part of this is Lot and Abraham. I feel like, Abraham was promised this heir, and that his progeny would be as numerous as the dust and as the stars, and yet Abraham did not realize the birth of this child for quite some time. And so I feel like Abraham looked at first to Lot as, is this going to be my progeny? Is Lot going to be it? Adopted Lot. And then Lot ended up splitting, going his own way with his own flocks. And so I feel like that was probably a huge disappointment in some respects to Abraham. So anyway, that split between Lot and Abraham.
So who here is familiar with the concept of womanist theology?
A little bit.
But...
Okay. Well, that's not what I'm going to talk about, but I was going to try and use that as an intro. So who's the main figure so Wade, you said hold on a second. Wade, you said you know a little bit about feminist theology. Could you tell us what you know?
Just that womanist theology looks at kind of the role of women, especially women of color, in the Bible, and kind of takes those parts and tries to look through the eyes of those women, rather than how I think in the Torah often the men seem particularly centered in their viewpoints do. So what is Abram's attitude towards Sarah or Abram's attitudes towards Hagar, rather than placing Sarai or Hagar at the center of their own stories.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, from the small amount I know about feminist theology, Hagar is a central character, and she's actually who I want to focus on today. So, what do you all know about Hagar?
She was Sarai's handmaiden and basically was sexually trafficked to Abraham to try and bear a child to him because Sarah couldn't. And then when Sarai eventually did have a son, then she wanted to kick Hagar out, and God preserved her and Ishmael. And the Bible records her naming of God as someone who sees me, I believe, is what she calls him. So
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Anyone else?
I think Hagar is constantly kind of put under the put under the rule of others, and enslaved, and it's like she like you would expect those relationships to be a bit reciprocal, that although she is a handmaid or a slave, that at least she is protected by those that Abraham and Sarah, and instead she's just kind of the way I read it, she's exploited. She's kind of their backup plan, that they don't quite trust God. And so she's their backup plan. And then when God comes through for them, they kind of toss her aside out of fear that, her child, being the firstborn, will then inherit what God has promised Abraham. And so, once God comes through for Abraham and Sarah, Sarah puts her out, and Abraham doesn't really defend her. And then, she finds that that she was under the protection of God, and so gets, I guess, her and Ishmael are protected by God, and she like you said, that she calls out to him as her savior.
Another thought I had too, and I kind of forgot about this, is that Hagar was an Egyptian. And it says in the text that she was, but I feel like there's kind of a role reversal here for kind of looking into the future, is that you have the Israelites basically exploiting an Egyptian. So like I said, it's kind of a role reversal of what we're going to see in the future. So the Israelites are oppressing an Egyptian versus the other way around in this particular story.
Great. Thank you all very much for your insights and contributions with Hagar. Yeah, and Hagar's featured in this portion and the next portion, and some of the Jewish sort of midrash or about her is actually really fascinating, and I probably hope to come back to that in future weeks. Something I've heard but wasn't able to verify during my searches. Um, so, like during this portion, as someone mentioned, like God or Hagar refers to God as right, the one who sees. And I've heard it said, although I can't verify this, that this is one of the first times that God is named by people. Um, right, so and just the significance when you look at it in context, that it's not Abraham, it's not one of the patriarchs or um, someone who's really considered significant in Jewish history. It's Hagar, who's a slave and or a servant, and who's who someone who's in fact treated poorly by Abram and his and Sarah, um, by Abram and Sarai, since they have not changed their names at this point, and just a lot of fascinating aspects to that. Um, and again, just like a woman being like the first person to name God is not a man but a woman, calling out in her moment of oppression, um, and so what do we know about the significance of names and naming in the Bible?
Well, I think they're often used as either um, prophecies, kind of how, um, like a way to describe the character um, that someone will become, or they are used, like especially the changing of a name is used to mark a significant transition. Um, and even when the name is just changing from, so, changing to something very similar, like Sarai to Sarah, or Abram to Abraham, or Saul to Paul, it's often the new name has a new significance that might play on the old name, but kind of change the path of that life.
It also seems to me that it's also a marker of a change in relationship too. That it's like giving, like when I started calling my husband Husbeast, those, it's like a pet name, but you nickname somebody out of affection, you know. So like a change in name, and we wouldn't say God had a pet name for Simon Peter, but you know, but it is sort of like to me, it always seems to be like a marker of something new in a relationship.
So what do you think is the significance of, and like what are your thoughts about how and why Hagar has named God and the name she chose for God?
I think, like Amanda says, it marks a change in her relationship to God and her understanding of God. And it could be that um, either, as an Egyptian, she didn't have, you know, God was just her master's God, or and that, I don't know if she, uh, retained uh, any relationship to quote unquote Egyptian gods, but this seems to mark her um, noticing God, noticing her, and having a relationship with a God who does take notice of people and of her and her son especially.
Yeah, it's kind of like a discovery that God is a person versus a force. You know, I was looking at the text here, and it says like in 16:13, it says, and she called the Lord, and that word Lord there translates Hashem, which is a very personal reference to God, versus Elohim, which is basically a recognition that God is like the force of forces. So it's this recognition of God as being a compassionate, personal God versus this force that is pretty much how other cultures recognize the gods as like nature or storms or lightning or earthquakes or whatever the case may be. It's this all of a sudden this awakening and recognition that God is a personal God.
So I think those are some great points, and especially like, Mitch, this idea of relationship and what Mitch was saying about being personal, like, and that's something I'm really looking forward to focusing on in this Torah cycle, is this tension between God being the God of all creation while also being the very personal God of Israel, and Israel being, the chosen people of God. And I think it's interesting to see this here. Like, this is, when Israel talks about its history, like they talk about, and right now we're in, pre-Israel times, and it's still, God is still personal, and just that there is already this building of that relationship that is fundamental to the way the world will end up functioning. Something I thought to ask for you all. So, we see Hagar naming God at this point. When she is in a very deep time of trouble, and so what are some other names of God that you feel are significant to you in your life? What are names you've enjoyed calling God or referencing to God to reflect the intimacy of the relationship?
Well, the word father comes to mind. So obviously that is a term dripping with intimacy in most cases, not in all cases, unfortunately, depending on what your experience was with your earthly dad. But, the word father kind of carries a tenderness to it that I find particularly appealing.
Right now, for me, in the situation that we're in, God as provider is important. But throughout my life, God is a presence that comforts, has been significant. The one who draws close to the brokenhearted and doesn't break off a bruised reed or snuff out a candle, a weak flame or anything. So, but God as comforter has been probably one of the chief names, so to speak, that I reflect on a lot. So,
Kind of as a sidebar here, Lee, I appreciate you and your long periods of silence. That's out of Don Cheever's playbook. So I just wanted to mention that to you.
Just trying to make everyone feel awkward, so hope that's working.
Someday, if you decide to change careers, you'd make a great, police officer, detective, or something, trying to interrogate somebody.
That's what you don't know is I'm already a spy, and that's what's my, this is just my day job. So I enjoyed Mitch's saying father. Like, there was definitely a period in my life where I would refer to God as Abba a lot, and just again, father and very intimate. And yeah, so I have another question which will involve more silence. So, um, so you've all referred to names we already know God by, right? Like comforter, redeemer, or provider. If you were to name God, right, like, try and create your own reference to God to reflect, who God's been to you in the past, who God is to you now, how would you refer to God?
It's interesting you bring that up because actually I think about that fairly frequently. And the one thing I think about, I'm thinking about now is patient one. Because I have habits that I would like to be rid of that I repeat over and over again. And I feel like God is patient and kind of long suffering and compassionate as I work through those issues in life.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing, Mitch. Um,
So even with my gray mustache, I'm still working through issues. Just
yeah, I'm not sure whether that's encouraging or daunting. It's like, oh, great, I get to do this. I get to do this. It's like, oh, not done yet. Got another 50 years to do this.
Yeah.
Could be doing this my whole life. So
You're welcome.
Could you repeat that question?
sure. So what I'm guess let me hold on. What is a name you would use to refer to God? Like try and make up your own name to reflect how God is present in your life, either in the past or at this time.
God who is probably exasperated with me, but is still loving. Or maybe I should just say God who is patient, like Mitch said.
I think maybe something like, and this is a very parental thing too, but like God who it turned out was right all along, even though you thought God must have been wrong. Sort of like, I guess, Abram and Sarah are dealing with here. It's like, I don't know, God. Well, I'll try this thing first, or I'll try that thing. I don't know. And then, kind of like with their parents, and then it turns out, it turns out they were right about that. I find myself in that position with God a lot.
I always think of that as like the teenager feeling, like you're in your late teens and you're like, dang, I didn't know everything, and like mom was really right about that. It's like, oh, huh, yeah.
I think one thing that I'm thinking about a lot lately, I posted about this on Facebook last night, but that, I, who am definitely liberal and am looking forward to a change in regime, um, needing to realize that the work is not done, even if who I voted for gets into office, that I still need to educate myself and be active as an ally for all kinds of minorities. There is still a lot of work to be done to reform our political system. So I guess for me, in a way, God who is not white, God who is not necessarily straight, God who is not a specific gender, God who is with the oppressed. And I'm not really an oppressed person. And so I have to continually remind myself that God is the God of the Hagars of the world. And if I want to align myself with God, I need to seek out and not seek out the Hagars necessarily, but at least seek out how to bring justice for the Hagars of the world, So
Would you be willing to say yours out loud?
Just that sometimes I have a hard time, uh, like relating to some of the uh, names of God, where it's the God of justice, and when you look around and you see injustice, and um, so for me, sometimes the God who grieves um, seems like the most relatable name.
Thank you a lot for sharing. So yeah, I've been, so yeah, hold on a moment. So I kind of came up with this idea about how would we name God, and Wednesday while listening to Mitch's study, and mine has come, one of the ways I was thinking about was also the God who grieves, but for very different reasons than Wade. I think, as most of us may know, my Nana has not been doing well. I've mentioned to several people that I was planning to go to Florida to help my aunt with caring for my grandmother, which I will no longer be doing because that's no longer necessary. My grandmother passed on Friday, and I'm still figuring out how I'm processing that. Like Mitch had mentioned, like father can be a really intimate term for God, but can also be really have a lot of baggage because not everyone has good relationships with their parents. And so my relationship with my father, both my parents, but this was my father's mother, so has been very rocky in the past. And in general, my family relations have been, even with each, like other, between other family members. And with my Nana's passing, it's something we've been expecting for the past month or so, since she got out from the hospital, hence my first trip down there. And my Aunt Gwen had talked to me and confided that, she's like, it feels so weird because all our family is coming back together for the first time in 10, 15 years. And she's talking, and she was like, yeah, I was talking to my boyfriend about it, Mr. Tim, and he says that's part of what death does is brings people together and gives them a chance to reunite. And that's something my family has very much been experiencing in the past month or so. Like my aunt and my father have been pretty much stopped talking several years ago, and so they've only just recently started talking again because of Nana's health conditions. And I've been on very rocky terms with my dad for many years, and and going down to care for my Nana, we both stayed in my Nana's condo and like took shifts looking after her, and it was very anyway, so it's also really mended and changed my relationship with my dad. So yeah, so part of me has been like, yeah, the God who grieves, and also trying to figure out that like a way to say like the God who mends, or the God who heals, which is, I feel like, very typical ones, but just that like, even though this has been a difficult time for my family and a time of grieving, it's also been a time of healing and trying to figure out how this affects how I see God and how to name God through this. So, yeah, and so, when, you know, didn't like, it's midweek, I go into study, haven't prepared to teach on Sunday, and just to hear that be like, oh, this is the section where Hagar names God, and knowing that this is one of the first times, and like I said, I think it's the first, but not positive, but that God has been given a personal name. It was very touching, and realize that that was what I thought would be a very interesting topic for today, and just a very, in some ways, a very personal topic. So I do want to thank you all for being vulnerable and open with this. Yeah. So, any other thoughts about naming God and about Hagar's naming God, about us naming God, about what we've said so far?
What's really interesting to think about too, Lee, is the fact of what God names us, besides the fact of what we name God. Because I think that I know, at least in my case, I forget about those things as much. And I think that's like really important to think about what God thinks about me, because of my own brokenness. And this is something that has gone on through a long period of time with me, is changing my own name in reference to who God calls me. Um, so, two, well, I guess kind of related things that I try to spend a period. It's funny that you go through period of silence. I think it's a really important. I go, at least anyway, through periods of silence with God. So I give him room to speak to me, and also to have room just to listen. I believe that God calls each of us loved and lovable. But unfortunately, in the screaming of life and all of the other voices around us, we kind of lose track of that, because there's so many different voices calling us the opposite of what God calls us. And we have a tendency to listen to those loud voices versus taking time to listen to this still small voice that says that I'm loved and I'm lovable. So I guess my whole point in saying that, I think it's just as important for us to hear what God says about us, as well as like what a name that we give to God. At least, for where I'm at in life right now, I think that's at least really important for me to spend time listening to the names that God calls me as well.
I think that goes also back to that discussion about intimacy, Mitch, that the importance we give to a voice and what we're called, is in direct proportion to the intimacy of that relationship. Whether it's I think even broken relationships can be very intimate in the sense that um even if it's broken, they have a lot of power in what they say. And so when you talk about you know what what you're called, and believing that, um I think of like Tana talking about just like when children are raised and are being told, you know you are this, or you have these attributes, and that's what they then believe. And um, so when you talk about that small voice of God telling you you're beloved, that you're worthy of love, that you are loved, you know, um, it's easy to have that drowned out by other intimate voices in your life that are telling you the opposite. But, you know, but Lee's point about this intimacy of naming God and God naming us, even if it's culturally a very small voice, um, it is the one that we can listen to and know that it is not lying to us. You know,
Yeah.
it's not telling us what we want or what it wants. It's telling us truth. So, and Lee, I'm very glad that you got to go down and experience that with your aunt uh, and with your grandmother. Um, you know, I hope that, I know sometimes these moments of opportunities, I guess you could say, for growth or healing take place at times where we're not ready. You know, we weren't anticipating those, and I know that that can make it hard too. So, so I just hope that you know, that time with your father, um, you know, that you felt the support of God and your family and others, you know, and that even now as you're kind of working through this with your dad and the passing of his mother and your nana, um, that that it can continue to be healthy growth.
Yeah, thank you, Wade. So something else that's been on my mind, I'm gonna move away from the portion if that's okay with everyone. Does anyone have some last thoughts, any closing thoughts about the portion they would like to share? Okay. So yeah, like my nana has been struggling, and to give a little more insight, she so at the start of August, she is, almost completely independent. She lives in her own condo. She, makes her meals. She has someone who comes and visits, spends a few hours with her, most days a week. But she does her own laundry. Um, she fell towards the end of August. Went into rehab, which was really terrible and did not help. At all, and probably just made things worse. So then she comes out of rehab. Within the next day or so, she has a perforated bowel and has to go back to the hospital. Yeah, and um, and ends up coming out of the hospital the second time around. Completely bedridden, like not gonna, like, almost no chance of recovery. Um, right, and so going back to, like I mentioned, like she was extremely independent. At she would have turned 95 in December, so doing like super well. And to give some more background, like my nana has always been a pretty strong and independent person. Like divorced my grandfather back in like late 60s, early 70s, opened her own restaurants. So not necessarily typical things for a woman at those times. So yeah, and then having to be bedridden, like she's like, I can't get up and go for a walk like I want to. She's like, I can't even walk to the bathroom. She's like, people ask me what I want to do every day, but it's like I don't have a choice. And like like while I'm there, I had like I would make her meals and smoothies, feed her, change her diaper. Like she could barely hold her own glass of water. Like um and um it just makes me think a lot about the idea of dignity recently. And in Jewish thought, usually in almost every case, euthanasia and suicide are not looked well upon. The idea that God's the one who brings life into the world, and it's up to God's timing to take life, for life to end. And part of that being a way to honor the dignity of human life and the dignity of and just thinking about my grandmother, like what does it mean to live a dignified life, especially at old age? And is it dignifying for my nana to be bedridden and have people feed her? And but is it then is it being dignified to consider things like euthanasia? So I guess just what are some of your thoughts about what it means for dignity and at the especially end of life sort of discussions?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough one for me, Lee, because obviously we have the technological ability anymore to keep people alive for a long period of time, though in essence, like 100 years ago, that individual may have passed, but with ventilators and whatever, life is able to be prolonged to a point where the quality of life then becomes, I feel like, the key issue. So what's the quality of life of an individual if they're bedridden on a ventilator, whatever. So I feel like that's a really tough one. And I don't feel like we talk about that very frequently at all. My dad passed away a few years ago, pretty much in the same vein that you were just describing with your Nana. My dad lived independently up until the last 3 weeks of his life. But on the other hand, my mom, who suffered a series of strokes, was in a nursing home the last 12 years of her life. And if it wasn't for my dad going in and taking care of her on a daily basis, I mean, I feel like in some respects, if there's not a loved one taking care of the person in a nursing home, it's almost like warehousing people. So difficult discussion, and I don't have any answers or really much to contribute to that other than the fact that I feel like we need to talk about this more frequently than what we do.
Thanks for sharing, Mitch. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to contribute or share? Okay. Well, that pretty much reaches okay. So yeah, so thank you all for participating. That's pretty much the end of my my list of things I want to mention today. And just to catch us up, so Tom was a little bit late. That's because he thought today was Saturday. Yeah, and yeah, and as someone mentioned, yep, today was. If you're feeling a little off today, that's probably from the time change. So it was very nice this morning, waking up at 7 and seeing the sun. I like that a whole lot. So, yeah. So, any general thoughts that people want to share before we start wrapping up?
I appreciate today's discussion. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts in my head, but things that aren't ready to be shared yet, So
Yes. Yeah, I had feeling today might be thought provoking, and I was like, should I be like, people, make sure you read ahead, or like, you know, or give like a, think a little bit about this. But I was like, I'll just do it all on the service. And yeah, I mean, if any time someone wants to discuss like whatever we talk about on Sunday at a later time, like, I mean, these are things I think about throughout the week. I'm very always interested and up for discussion. And yeah, thanks for letting me know that. I was hoping to be thought provoking. I think this is an interesting portion. I think almost all portions are interesting, but
Yeah, I would echo what Amanda shared. I thought it was really thought provoking as well. One I guess last thing I'd throw out there is that one thing that intrigues me about this entire portion is just even the meaning of the portion. Lech Lecha literally means journey to yourself. And so Abraham obviously had a journey, and I hadn't really considered Hagar, but Hagar also had a journey to herself throughout, her encounter with God and her experiences with Abraham and Sarai. So, and I've been thinking about this all week, like wrapping my arms around that journey to yourself bit is a pretty big thing. I've been kind of contemplating that all week.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Mitch. That does, I guess, two things that fallen by the wayside in my mind. So, one, I briefly touched on womanist theology, and Hagar is considered very important for that because she kind of exemplifies this idea of, God making a way where there's no way, and that's a little more. I think that's a little more evident in next week's portion where we see that. But again, just God answering the voice of the oppressed and saying, like, you can do this, you can make it through, whether it's going back to your oppression or whether it's or leaving your oppression and finding a way where there is no way. And then also, just talking about a little bit of the world today, and especially politics, the idea of grieving. In Judaism, a really important topic is the idea of, and I can't remember the Hebrew phrase, the idea of repairing the world. And then that's one of the main responsibilities of Israel and the people of God, is to repair the world. And I think that's a very, when you really think about, very interesting. I mean, Judaism is, over 2,000 years old, and even if we were to say that that idea of repairing the world was to be a medieval or rabbinic Judaism, it's still an idea that's been around for then 500, 1,000 years, and that somehow in all that time that Judaism recognizes that the world constantly needs improvement and constantly needs repairing, and that's something that we as the people of God are routinely called to, and thinking about that in terms of, whoever wins on Wednesday, what can we do to bring about a just world? What can we do to be loving to our neighbors, and to be loving towards God? And, with, talking about my Nana, like, what does it look like to be repairing the world while starting with the relationships in my family? And, and even, what Mitch was saying, like, this idea of coming to ourselves, like, I've heard from other wisdom traditions the idea, like, you will be at peace at the world when you're at peace with yourself. And just that, or like G.K. Chesterton, like a quote of his, like, he was asked, what's one of the biggest, problems faced in the world, and he says, like, I am. And the idea that, starting with ourselves. And so just, I guess, another name of God I've been thinking is like the God who repairs, or the God who, and in ways I think of it as, I don't know if any of you know, like, I can't remember the name of this. There's a Japanese art where if vases crack, you then, instead of just putting it back, they sort of use precious metals, often gold or platinum, to repair the vase, saying that, like, to the idea that there is beauty in fragility and in repairs and in being broken. Like, that's part of life, and that's and I'm sort of rambling at this point and just like connecting thoughts, but like, in seeing that Japanese art and talking about now, it reminds me of that Leonard Cohen, is that the singer, right? The cracks are how the light gets in. So yeah, so that's all I got for my teaching discussion part. So if we thank you, Wade is kintsugi is the Japanese art, so if you ever want to look that up.